Welcome to First. I'm Michelle Poston along with Mark Eichman and Shirley Min. New technologies being developed at the University of Delaware offer hope to disabled children who want to lead a better life of their own.
School students from the tri-state area are ready to lend their voice to the debate over gun violence in the wake of the Parkland shootings. This week we'll offer a discussion of the Second Amendment.
A unique set of artwork sheds some light on children living with a rare disease. We'll go inside the exhibit, Beyond the Diagnosis. It's all this week on First. Your public media news magazine starts now.
We offer some technological innovations this week, and they're all right here in Delaware. There's work being done on University of Delaware's Star Campus to help children with mobility impairments. In this week's First Look, we'll see what graduate students are doing to create assistive technologies or clothing with sensors to increase a disabled child's mobility. A quick glance and you may think this is a sewing class, but it's not. The mission here is creating clothing, and not just any type of clothing. Martha Hall is actually a PhD student in the Biomechanics and Movement Science program.
We do wearable technology, we do different kinds of devices and clothing with devices embedded in them, all to help kids with disabilities.
One of those kids is 14-year-old Faith, who has cerebral palsy. Faith is participating in Hall's dissertation study to design unique jeans that will ultimately help children with disabilities be more independent.
Remember, point your toe.
Mom.
In the video, she's trying to put on an ordinary pair of jeans. As you can see, the video shows how challenging it can be for the teenager.
Cerebral palsy in particular, several of the children have, and that can look very different depending on the child and depending on the severity of the presentation. But for a lot of the kids, it may be challenges with range of motion, so you can't quite get your ankle pointed in order to get your foot through your pant leg.
Children may also be challenged with closures like snaps, buttons, or zippers. Faith is seen here again doing a number of different exercises to help get a better understanding of her clothing needs.
The dissertation project is all about creating clothing for people who are a little bit older than the typical kids that we work with in the lab. So kids age 5 to 14, kind of when you start to care a little bit more about how you look and want to fit in with your peers a little bit more, creating clothing that they can get easily in and out of on their own.
Research for this type of clothing all takes place inside the Move to Learn Innovation Lab, located on the University of Delaware's Star Campus.
We've worked with children that have a broad range of disabilities. The most common one that I personally have worked with is called arthrogryposis, which means that the child means curvature of the joints, but the child is fine mentally, but they really have a difficult time lifting their arms up. So we've worked on creating devices that make it easier for them to put their hands in front of their face, which allows them to make connections with the outside world and when they're playing with things.
According to Ben Greenspan, measuring movement is key.
For some of the projects that we work on, the wearable technology is just trying to measure movement, so we have a better understanding of how the child's actually moving in a natural environment, not just in a lab space.
Grant money is definitely important to this lab. The National Science Foundation recently awarded money to also allow students to work on a smart compression garment that will hopefully translate into a user-controlled power exoskeleton.
And that's on definitely the larger side of funding, but also it's really nice with this huge push for open source electronics. A lot of the sensors and microcontrollers and things of that nature that previously wouldn't have been affordable in years past are much, much more accessible to purchase on the internet now.
Meanwhile, what goes on in this lab could eventually get the attention of some retail giants.
Target has just recently started to be interested in designing or providing clothing for kids with special needs. So they just released a line of children with autism, so things that don't have tags that can irritate the skin or seams in places that could bother a child.
Committee members on Hall's dissertation have developed a relationship with Target, so there may be some potential work in the near future.
If we could help to create clothing for kids and have it distributed through an amazing company like Target, that would just make it even more available and even more accessible, which at the end of the day is our goal.
In addition to grant money from the National Science Foundation, which totaled more than $1 million for the project, supporters include partners from the University of Minnesota, Virginia Tech, as well as donations from the community and grants from the Delaware Economic Development Office and the University of Delaware Research Foundation.
So a really collaborative effort.
Yeah.
So how long does the project run?
Well, Mark, this project is about a 4-year project where team members will continue to work on developing soft, low-profile sensing technologies that look and feel like everyday clothing. What's unique about the clothing is that it will also feature shape memory fibers to assist with limb movements.
Very cool. Well, if you want to learn more about these projects, go to sites.udel.edu/move to learn.
The topic of guns and how to regulate them will most likely dominate the news throughout this month. Last week, a bill was introduced in the Delaware legislature to raise the age to buy a shotgun from 18 to 21. It's now 21 to buy a handgun. Students from several schools in Delaware plan to show their solidarity with students in Parkland, Florida, as they call for comprehensive gun reform. And students from around the region will join in a symbolic walkout as a protest next week. All of this prompts questions about the Second Amendment. WHYY's Tracy Matisak recently sat down with law professor Laura Little from Temple University and Delaware Law Dean Rod Smala to talk about it.
Sounds like the founding fathers were saying that having a weapon or being required to have a weapon is a given, but that it's for the common defense more than being for personal defense.
And it depends on who you ask.
Right. That's the question. Is it an individual right or is it a collective right of the state?
And we really didn't have an answer until 2008. So even though this was written in 1789, it takes well over 200 years for the Supreme Court of the United States to answer the question. Washington, D.C. had heavily restricted the carrying of weapons inside D.C., as many American cities had tried to do to deal with gun violence. And in a 5-4 decision called the Heller case, the Supreme Court says it's an individual right. It's not just a collective right. And therefore, if you live in Washington, D.C., you have a right to own a weapon, you have a right to keep a weapon in your house, and you have some right, at least, to take it about town. And we're trying to figure out exactly what that now means.
So we have what the Supreme Court said, and we have federal laws, but then we also, Laura, have state laws, and they can vary widely. So how do we sort through that, and what happens when a state law bumps up against the federal law?
So the Supreme Court said in Heller that this right to bear arms was not absolute, that it was a limited right and could be subject to sort of reasonable state restrictions. We know that its reading of the Second Amendment makes clear that the right can't be taken away altogether, but it can in fact be subject to reasonable restrictions by the states. And you're absolutely right, there's a huge variety among the state laws as to ways in which this right has been in fact curtailed. So the notion is that the Supreme Court laid out this general principle. It's an individual right, it is limited, and the states have experimented with various different restrictions on the right. Those laws have pretty uniformly been challenged but upheld under the Second Amendment cases. And the Supreme Court has not shown any interest in getting back involved. So in a way, the Heller decision and then the decision 2 years later dealing with Chicago, the McDonald case, sort of sets the general umbrella, and the states are experimenting in different types of restrictions, and it appears as though the Supreme Court's not currently interested in getting involved.
And so, Laura, would you agree with me that this is really more a political question, a question for our culture, than it is probably a constitutional question? In this sense, whatever states and localities are willing to try to deal with gun violence, the probability is, unless they go way overboard and try to ban them entirely, that courts are going to be increasingly inclined to uphold them, and the Supreme Court is going to be increasingly inclined to say, you all work it out, we're not going to intervene.
That would be my prediction given the current composition of the court. That is, we have different membership today than we did 10 years ago with the Heller case. But the basic ideological lineup has been the same. So assuming that we have that same equilibrium, I agree that, in fact, if there's any changes, it's one that deals with culture and politics rather than with constitutional law.
And if you think about what kinds of changes we might be talking about and how they might be challenged in court, I think it would be who gets to carry weapons. If you're mentally ill, if you've been engaged in domestic violence, if you have a conviction, maybe an age restriction. So how can we narrow the people who carry weapons? What kinds of weapons? Can we restrict it to the kinds of weapons that would be used for self-defense primarily, and avoid very highly potent military-style offensive weapons? And then the when and where. Can we restrict at what places you can carry them and at what times you can carry them? And we don't have Supreme Court answers to those questions, and there may or may not be a political will to experiment. But if there is, I think what you're hearing from us is it doesn't seem that likely the Constitution would stand in the way.
And Rod, you talked about the political will, and we've seen now so many of these mass shootings that are, from what I understand, a uniquely American problem. Do either of you see that will changing, especially now that we have students who are getting actively involved and there's been a louder outcry than we've seen before? Is it likely that we might see some changes, at least at the state level, as it relates to gun laws?
I mean, I think we've seen it already to the extent that the gun lobby seems to be trying to get ahead of the story, in that they're trying to identify certain types of restrictions which they're willing to live with, and to that extent, sort of make sure those restrictions are as confined as possible. So I think in terms of the politics, it has a lot to do with the strength of the gun lobby.
And this feels to me a bit like a flexion point, similar to what we went through a couple of years ago after the shootings in the church in Charleston, where places like South Carolina that had flown the Confederate battle flag on the state capitol finally took it down. And then we had the massive debate over the monuments of the Confederacy. And that debate's still going on, we're still working it out, but it seemed to change the dynamic. And I'm beginning to sense that that dynamic is changing. There will be battles, there will be fights, it will take years to work it out, but I feel the momentum is shifting somewhat.
The other possible analogy that I see is to the Me Too movement. That is where we somehow, because of the current political climate or whatever, hit a tipping point that inspired the Me Too movement. And one wonders whether we're at a similar tipping point with respect to gun rights.
Discussions over the Second Amendment and the gun debate is something we'll be following on all of our WHYY platforms. Follow reports at whyy.org/news, on NPR News, on WHYY FM, and on the PBS NewsHour.
We're going to continue the discussion on guns and the upcoming student march by turning to Rob Torno. He's here with his editorial cartoon view of all this. Welcome, Rob.
How you doing?
So this really comes down to the question, and your cartoon points to this, of what do the expectations of American adults have for American teenagers?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have these kids who are coming out and they're protesting because of the violence that they're on the front lines receiving.
Right.
And because some people don't agree maybe with their take or opinion, they're not validating it, they're just treating them like kids, that they're not supposed to have opinions, that they're not supposed to think critically, all the things that these teachers are teaching them to do in the first place. So it just strikes me as being sort of patronizing to these kids.
And it really comes down to whether it's racism or sexism. Anytime you group large groups of people into kind of one category, and it sort of seems like some people are trying to do that to teenagers. These are just a bunch of dumb millennials who eat Tide Pods and don't get to have an opinion on this.
Right, and it's fine to disagree with them. You don't automatically assume that they're right, but like it means you have a discussion. It means to talk about the issues and not just disregard their opinions because they happen to be kids, you know, validate their opinions and have a thoughtful discussion about it.
And maybe because of this reaction, maybe fuels a little bit of that teenage angst that they're going to even fight back more against this and fight for what they believe in.
Yeah, I mean, the administrators of Caesar Rodney can delete messages all they want. You know, this is just only going to encourage these kids to speak their minds more, and it's important conversation.
All right, and we'll keep having it. Thanks, Rob. You can read more of Rob's thoughts at WHYY.org/news. You can also follow him and tweet at him at Rob Torno. And you should.
Coming up on First, need anyone? Experience a beverage that proves everything that is old can be new again. And Delaware's Teacher of the Year proves that her spunk is an infectious teaching tool at Sussex Tech.
Do you totally understand the relationship between elements of style and rhetoric?
A unique art exhibit is now on display at Nemours AI DuPont Hospital for Children in Wilmington. The groundbreaking exhibit focuses on children living with rare diseases. 19-year-old Joanna Costa loves music. She's playing the piano in the atrium of AI DuPont Hospital for Children in Wilmington, where she's received treatment her whole life.
I was born with arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, or AMC, where for some reason the baby doesn't move in the womb, and so it affects the muscles and joints.
AMC affects 1 in 3,000 people in the U.S. In Joanna's case, the rare disease keeps her from raising her arms above her shoulders, and she can only use 2 fingers on each hand. And yet, she can play like this. Joanna's portrait is the newest addition to a traveling art exhibit called Beyond the Diagnosis, started by Patricia Welton.
There's 7,000 different rare diseases. And in the United States, they affect about 15 million kids. We're kind of invisible to a lot of the medical community, the research institutes, mostly the government.
95% of all rare diseases lack treatment of any kind. And with those kinds of numbers, Welton, whose own 2 daughters suffer from a rare disease that affects their connective tissue, hopes the exhibit raises awareness, increases funding for research, and most importantly, puts a face to some of these little-studied diseases.
We need the FDA to see these kids. You know, this is who you work for. This is who everybody is working for. We're all working, in the end, it's for these kids and to find a treatment for these kids. I mean, I would prefer a cure, but I'll settle for a treatment.
Artists from around the world have donated their time and talents to painting a portrait for the exhibit. When Welton started, she had 17 portraits. Now, 3 years later, she has more than 100 and is reaching a larger audience than she could have ever imagined. She was just asked to bring the exhibit to Botswana.
I'm an extremely practical human being, but for me, this seems like magic. It really does.
Biomedical engineer Dr. Tariq Rahman works at AI and has worked with Joanna for 15 years. When he heard the exhibit was coming, he knew he wanted to paint Joanna's portrait.
And I've seen her grow from a 5-year-old who came into our lab eating Skittles to now she's a junior at Temple. So I've seen that progression. It will bring visibility to rare diseases. It helps the kids enormously.
My favorite part of this exhibit idea is that it doesn't emphasize the disability, it shows the person's face. And I really like that. We're all people, and that's my favorite part of it.
Welton one day hopes to have a portrait for all 7,000 rare diseases. The Rare Disease United Foundation is the advocacy organization behind the exhibit. You can learn more about both at rarediseaseunited.org. Beyond the Diagnosis is on display at AI through next week.
Delaware's 2018 Teacher of the Year uses her captivating spunk to keep her students interested. Her kids are always learning something new, as you will see when First goes inside the classroom of Virginia Fracucci from Sussex Tech in Georgetown, Delaware.
I've been nominated before and I've never accepted the nominations. It's a lot of work, to be honest with you, But another huge part of Teacher of the Year is having a platform or a message. And while I've always known that I love kids, I feel that the climate in our nation and our culture right now is such that I have a lot to say about academic discourse and empathy and understanding the why behind our students' behaviors. And so more than ever, I have a platform.
Do you totally understand the relationship between elements of style and rhetoric?
I think that passion begets passion. And so when I'm really hype, they tend to get really hype. And then when they're really hype, I get even more hype. So it's just this really symbiotic relationship.
Give me statistics and facts that support.
Miss Percucci is one of the most, like, I don't know, is spunk a good word? Like, she is one of the spunkiest ladies that I know. Like, she just gets up there and she throws herself into everything we do. And I think too often that we're trapped in classrooms where our teacher is expecting us to do something that they wouldn't do themselves, or they're not invested in it, so how can we be expected to learn to it? But she is just a teacher that's invested into everything she's talking about.
A text logos is easier to detect in something that can be proven with facts and statistics.
I absolutely press at our school with curriculum choices. I press that we connect with kids first through writing. And so once they write something, and I get to respond to it, and I put as much energy into the response as they put into the text, they recognize, okay, so maybe she's in this for more than just a paycheck, and maybe she really cares about what I have to say. And so I recognize the value of their voices.
It's important for students to actually care about their education instead of just doing it for a grade and going through the motions. I think that she really opens up our minds to see a different way of learning in a different environment. I think that she's made me care more about education. Once more, she really does motivate us to do better and to care about the things that we do. And I think that throughout her class, she's really put an emphasis on doing what you want to do.
I'm gonna play basketball at Arcadia University. But even more than that, I'm gonna major in secondary English education. So Mrs. Percucci is my idol in a lot of ways because I literally want to be here. I just hope one day that I can have a classroom that is as inviting and fun and warm and loving as hers.
It's an opportunity to change people's lives, you know, and especially at this time in their lives, adolescence is so hard. And they're trying to figure out what they believe in, and they're trying to figure out a direction, and that's really daunting. And I get to help with that and maybe leave a positive mark, or I just get to be part of their journey. And also, more importantly, I learn more from them.
One of Percucci's main focuses is to get her students to understand that they're not just doing their schoolwork for a grade, but they're doing it to better understand themselves and the world around them.
The Vikings have landed in Delaware. No, we're not talking about the NFL team, but the Birmingham Eatery, which is brewing up the ancient drink known as mead and serving it up in their Norse-inspired tasting room in Milton. The idea is 20 years in the making, so come along for our first experience.
Welcome to Birmingham Eatery. The Birmingham Eatery is 15 years of mead making. It was a dream that I had to open a meadery, and now it's finally open. Mead is the oldest alcoholic beverage. It's essentially wine made from honey. It goes back over 9,000 years ago. Essentially what mead is, it's just honey, water, and yeast and fermentation process. I got into making mead from reading mythology. I was always interested in Nordic mythology and Beowulf, Norse tales, Greek myths, and things like that. And mead is mentioned in a lot of those old stories. I'm pretty creative. I'm very artistic. I like to cook, so a lot of my mead recipes have to do with things I've cooked, or desserts, or things I'm reading about in history. So I just put it all together. It's a little bit of myth, a little bit of magic, a little bit of science. I've won awards at Meadlenium. It's a competition in Florida. Mead Free or Die. It's for commercial and amateur mead makers. And I've took 2 best of shows at that competition, so I was very proud of that. The little cups, those are Mazer cups. That's the biggest mead competition in the world, and I've won 2 Mazer cups at that, so I'm very proud of that. Wanted to kind of look like an old Viking hall, but have a modern appeal to it. So that's why we chose brighter colors and lots of woodwork. And we wanted it to be kind of lively and fun inside, but still give it that old world character. The reaction has been great. People come in and they're kind of wowed by the mead hall, itself. They're looking around and they look at all the carvings and the woodwork and the bar.
It is really good. I like beer, and I've heard a lot about mead, and just thought I'd try it. It's pretty amazing. And it gives you that feel, that Scandinavian feel. When you think about mead, you think about the Vikings and them sitting around a big fire in a big hall, and I think it's really cool.
These are a nice balance. What they say they're going to taste like, they actually do. These guys are real friendly, they're real helpful, and they definitely get a good product.
You feel like a Viking today?
Oh, I do. I need my horns.
It's very exciting. It's very humbling. I never thought my mead would be like being served to the public, because it was always like something I made for at home and family and shared with my friends, and it's just very exciting. I hope that they think it's special and they can see that the work and the passion behind it. I hope that brings them some joy, because they're drinking something that's very ancient but created in a new way.
Both John and his business partner Robert have been in the brewing business for more than 15 years, and when not working in the meadery, they both work at Milton's Dogfish Head Brewery. The Birmingham Eatery is open Friday through Sunday each week, and you can get more information when you visit them on the web at birminghammeatery.com.
Next week on First, the transgender notification debate. Should schools have the right to let students decide which gender they identify with, and possibly keep that information private from parents? It's generating a lot of controversy.
That story and more next time. That is First for this week. We thank you so much for watching. For Nichelle Polston and Mark Eichman, I'm Shirley Min. Have a great week.